Welcome to the Starting Points Education Channel. My name is Loretta Depka, and tonight's podcast guest is Pat Obst, who has been doing a series for us on doing grief well. Please take a moment and go and look back at our 2021 podcast. You will find Pat, I believe, on 4 of them, but at least you can catch up. And happy 2022. Can't believe we're already there. So without further ado, let me introduce Pat Obst. For those of you who don't know her, she is an LCSW who specializes in loss and grief. She's been in practice for about 20 years. She started her specialization in grief counseling about 19 years ago after the loss of her infant son, Ricky. Something you should know is I've often said to Pat, how can you spend your entire practice on grief and loss? And rather than try to answer her answer, I'm going to let Pat speak up here and tell us all how, why a practice in grief and loss and how you deal with it emotionally yourself.
Thank you, Loretta. So personally, of course, it's to continue the legacy of my son, Ricky, because this is him working through me. But as far as, how I can hold up doing that is I consider it a privilege to be able to help people heal. And it just fills my heart as I see people recreate their lives. I have a client who lost her daughter tragically, and to see the transformation in her life. I actually have 2 pictures on my phone of her, and one is her giving an interview with the news because her daughter was murdered, and just, her face obviously is in tremendous grief. And the other picture, she has this wide grin, her hair is flying back, she's on a boat and on a lake that she moved to with her significant other retired. And just
that's fabulous.
See that transformation and to be a part of that. That's what my passion is to help people to live again after loss of any kind. So that's part of the reason why I do it.
Well, the last podcast we were together on was grieving through the holidays, and that was received extremely well. But you always bring up this word, uncomplicated and complicated grief. So maybe we should start with, what are the types of grief?
So a lot of times people put grief just in a bucket, right? You're grieving, period. And everybody should be over it in the same amount of time. And we leave it at that. But the different types of grief are, well, I'd like to just give a definition of grief in general.
Okay.
We even don't quite understand what that is. And I'm just going to read this because it's pretty precise. Grief is the response to losing a loved one. It contains thoughts, behaviors, emotions, and physiological changes. When the loss is permanent, so too is grief, but its form evolves and changes as a person adapts to the loss. People have natural ways of adapting to loss, usually with the support of friends and relatives, and everyone does it in their own way. You can think of healing after a loss as analogous to healing after a physical wound. The loss, like a physical injury, evokes pain, which can be very strong. Physical injuries activate a healing process. Loss does too. Wound healing can be delayed, and so too can the process of adapting to loss. When this occurs, grief can be pervasive and prolonged, dominating a bereaved person's life with an undue influence of their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And that's what takes us into complicated grief. So acute grief is like, that's what we're feeling in the very beginning, right? That's what I call that raw grief right after the loss. Then there's so besides different types of grieving, there are different stages, right? So there's the acute, and then there's the adapting to the loss. And that's when that acceptance of the reality of it starts to kick in, and we start to kind of get our footing again about life, and then have the capacity for well-being. Integrated grief that's the lasting form of grief. That's where, yes, our grief is part of our story, but it's not in the forefront. Quickly, one of the things that we did in the afterwards program that I did years ago with a colleague of mine, we had these threads. There were 7 colors. There was black, brown, gold, and then red, green, purple. There were 6 colors. So we had people braid these. They were just these like embroidery threads. We had people braid them in. We paired people up, and they could make a bracelet out of it or a bookmark or whatever. And the black thread represented their losses, and the brown thread, like all the muck that kind of goes along with that. And then all the colored threads represented just all the different parts of life, the people in their lives, whatnot. The gold thread represented resilience. And what we found was when people braided them, the black thread was still in there, right? The thread of loss. But what stood out the most was the gold thread, the resilience. And so we can still be resilient, and it doesn't mean that our loss was taken away or didn't happen. It's weaved in the story of our lives, and that's what integrated grief is. And then we have prolonged, they call it prolonged grief disorder or complicated grief, complex grief. And that's where we get stuck. And that's what we can continue to talk about, is what that looks like, and then how to keep that from happening, or how to get out of it when it does happen. Let you take it from there.
So what are sort of the sticking points that, or the points where we get stuck that can turn uncomplicated grief into complicated grief?
Okay. So there can be, some of these things happen in the early raw grief, but then they dissipate, where in complicated grief, they stay. So there's a disbelief, right? There's that, I can't believe this happened. Or the protest, this can't have happened. There's no way. There's imagining the alternative scenarios, and that's the woulda, coulda, shouldas. If only this, if I would have said this or done this, this wouldn't have happened. As somebody whose son fell off of a mountain. Well, if only he didn't go mountain climbing that day, right? There's different scenarios. That self-blame or that anger, like we can get stuck where we don't let that go. Judging our grief, when people are like, oh, I should be moving further along, I shouldn't be crying anymore. That can keep us stuck. Survivor guilt, right? We've all heard about that on the news and whatnot.
Absolutely.
Like, oh, why wasn't it me? And that can keep us stuck. And then the behaviors. So those are some of the thoughts and feelings, but then the behaviors, things like avoiding triggers. Now, it's okay early on to avoid triggers. Okay, we're so raw. Just like if we harmed ourselves physically, we would, make sure we didn't touch that part if we burned ourselves, right? We'd be careful not to rub that part of our hand on something, because we know that that's a sensitive area. So avoiding triggers is okay early on, but some people are like, I can never go to this place again, and I can never drive down that road, and I can never, like, ever again, even though they need to, in order to get to work or whatever. They have to learn to adjust to that, but some people can't. The inability, they can't move forward in any other area of their lives. And another behavior is an inability to connect with other people, whether it's new people or the people who are still in their lives. They can't, the missing of the other person is so pervasive that they can't even connect with those other people. So those are ways that that people can get stuck, and they can just keep ruminating on this, and then it actually increases the emotional activation of all those painful feelings.
So then what are the symptoms to differentiate between complicated and uncomplicated? I'm still a little stuck on those words and I need to move on. I know, Pat, but you know, I just always get stuck with, if it's my grief, it's complicated.
Oh, well, as David Kessler, he's a grief specialist. He said, you know, when people ask him, they said, you know, what's the worst kind of grief, and you know, what's the worst kind of loss, all that, and he says, your loss is the worst loss.
I like him, Pat.
Yeah, he's great. You know, I tap into his stuff a lot. I'd love to meet him and actually work together with him someday. So what does it look like, I guess is what you're asking me, is what does complicated grief look like? Intense sorrow, pain, and rumination. Again, it's okay early on, but how intense is that still on sort of a regular basis? You might have your moments. Look, 2-3 times a year, I have a meltdown about Ricky, and it's 19 years. It's okay. There's still going to be that intensity, but it's not pervasive. It's here and then it's done. Focus on little else but the loved one's death. It's like people who keep coming back to talking about it. That's different than talking about the person, as in sharing a story. And but if you keep coming back to the missing of them, you know, out again more than a year, then that means there's something more complicated about this. Extreme focus on the reminders of the loved one, intense and persistent longing or pining, not just missing, but you know, I think we all know the difference between pining for someone and just, oh, I miss them.
Right.
Problems accepting the death. I had a client who said to me, I just have to accept that my son is gone. And I said, well, what does acceptance mean? And she said, it means that I'm okay with it. And I said, well, that's part of why you're stuck. Because will you ever be okay with your son being gone? She said, no. I said, well, then we need to come up with a different definition of acceptance. And so we worked on that. And then she got unstuck.
Right.
Numbness and detachment. When people are, you know, that's a lot of times where you'll see isolation continues. It's again, that's okay to some degree early on, but that needs to not continue, as well as the numbness. You know, when people are numbing out with work, right, where they'll just work, numbing out with alcohol, that sort of thing. Again, if that goes on long term. Bitterness, they get stuck in their anger, feeling that life holds no meaning or purpose, like that they haven't been able to begin to grab onto other things in life. A lack of trust in others, they just don't think anybody understands and nobody can help them. An inability to enjoy life at all, or think about positive experiences with their loved one. They have to, when it gets really intense, they have trouble carrying out normal routines, like functioning is not happening. I had somebody who lost her daughter, and she basically for 3 years kind of holed up and on her, you know, by herself. She didn't really function. And then she came to see me 3 years later, and we got her unstuck, and she's doing great. Depression, as opposed to, you know, grieving, it turned into the depression that you see where they're sleeping all the time and that sort of thing. Just feeling like life isn't worth living anymore without this person, or, you know, since I've been divorced, or since I lost my job, you know, whatever it may be. So it's really that intensity and the length, like things don't move. It's like a stagnant pond instead of that flowing river that has movement.
So what are some of the coping skills to get through that, that's creative and supports the individual?
So some of the coping skills that Some people have skills, coping skills that they've used kind of throughout their life to help them get through tough times. And some of those coping skills are going to work for them. But sometimes people say to me, exercising used to help me through everything, but it's not helping me through this, right? So people really have to be willing to develop new coping skills because the old ones don't always work for them. And sometimes there are a lot of different factors involved, like if there are complications of like a really dependent relationship, if there's been social isolation, if there's been trauma, if someone has had traumatic childhood experiences, a lot of whatever the mental health issues they might have had from that are going to complicate their grief process. So sometimes the context of the person's life affects whether or not it kind of turns into a complicated loss. So it's not just the length and the intensity, but what's all the context of that as well. So how do we cope with that? How do we do grief well around that? We have to be
How can we prevent those complications from seeping in?
Well, preventing them, we have to prevent them in ways that are involve awareness. There has to be a level of awareness that it's happening. And so that means we got to be able to listen to what other people are saying to us. If they're saying, not, oh boy, it's been 6 months, it's time for you to get over it, not that kind of thing. But if people are noticing certain things, we have to be willing to listen to that, because we can't fix what we don't know. So we have to be aware that things are not moving, that we're stuck in almost like we have lead feet. And if we're not aware, we can't fix it. So embracing, sitting with it is important, but we have to talk about it. We have to be willing to go to support groups, or if that's too hard, go online to a support group, and be able to stick with any kind of a treatment plan that maybe our doctor, whether it's medication, right? Or they talk about exercising to release some of that pent up, because if somebody's stuck in anger, right, how you going to release that if it's pent up? Reaching out to the faith community. Some people, even if they've lost their faith through a tragedy, inching our way back towards it to see, is this something that can help me again? And keeping the communication with God going, even if we're mad at God, right? Keep that communication going, because that's a support system that we lost. If we were a faithful person, we might have just lost that support system. And that may be what's making it complicated too, right? We've lost a major support.
That's really true, because people can't understand why God would do this to them. Or
right. And that may be the podcast down the road, is really kind of how to rebuild that if you're somebody who
right.
that hasn't been a support for you.
And you were talking more spiritually than religion wise, correct?
Right. Whatever your faith base is.
Right.
For some people it is, it's nature, right? So, and being open to the possibility. A lot of times I'll tell people who are, in this complex situation, rather than saying, yeah, but, just be open to the possibility of healing. And sometimes that's all they need.
Well, that's a life lesson in itself. I mean, seriously, grief or no grief, that is really a life lesson right there, Pat.
Right. And then, because then, see, when we're stagnant pond, nothing's coming in, nothing's going out, right?
Right.
But when we open up to the possibility, okay, now it becomes a bit of a two-way street. And then we can, things that are coming in, they actually can be absorbed more. And so the getting unstuck is simply a willingness. And sometimes it's a choice. We might not feel it, right? We don't feel like being open, but we make that choice, kind of like the woman on the podcast that we just did on the holidays. She chose to experience joy on the holiday. She could grieve the other 351 days of the year, but on Christmas she was choosing not to grieve. So starting to make choices is another way that we can get out of complicated grief instead of going around in those circles. We call it the Jersey Circle, right?
Absolutely. We all know those circles.
Right. You got to get off at an exit. So let's pick an exit, right? Whether it's joining a support group or starting to go out with people. Don't have an expectation. Just go out, even if you're still feeling your grief while you're out. Because you're giving yourself the opportunity for something to come in. Right?
Makes perfect sense.
And taking care of yourself, making that decision to count yourself as important. Because
now that's another life lesson.
when we're so focused on the loss of our loved one, they have such ultimate importance. And we're totally forgetting not only about the importance of the other people in our lives, but the importance of ourselves. And sometimes if we tap into what would your loved one want for you?
Right.
Now we can start caring for ourselves. In fact, the woman that I talked about when I first started, about who had lost her daughter, and I have those two pictures.
Right.
What helped get her unstuck was connecting to her daughter based on what she knew her daughter wanted for her. And so once she made that connection, her goal was to be happy and healthy, which she knew her daughter wanted.
There you go.
And so it's like, what is going to be that draw to pull you out of it? Because sometimes it's too hard to push yourself out of it. So you need something that's going to pull you. We have to be creative, right? Engaging with things like art therapy, journaling, whether there are, some people it's prayer, some people it's meditation. I have being able to start putting on paper or on video the positive memories, because one thing that keeps people stuck is it's all the trauma or the negative memories, right?
Right.
About that experience of them dying of the cancer or that sort of thing. But if they can, I have people start, just even if it's a couple sentences, write down an experience, a memory that was positive. There's a woman who she lost her husband young from cancer, and every time, because she's young, of course it's video, right, as opposed to
right.
She would hold the phone up and tell the story. And so she has this whole just video log for herself and for her children of stories that she remembers about her.
And she remembers them, right?
Yeah. And then there's this other woman who's, she's older, so she writes things down. And her one of her fondest memories is that her son had cerebral palsy and was nonverbal. But one of the things that he would get so excited about was his applesauce when it was like tuck-in time. And so that memory of sharing applesauce, and he was so excited about it, and he just loved it. And so that, in fact, her husband now, in a humorous way, calls his wife applesauce.
Oh, that's
He
funny.
yells up the steps, "Hey, applesauce!"
It's great.
So it's those kinds of things that we're so immersed in complicated grief, in the bubble of the sadness or the anger or the guilt, and we need something that's going to pull us out. So we have to shift, and sometimes it's a therapist who needs to help you to do that, or nudge you to do those things, like journal. Oh, I hate to journal. Oh, I hate to write. You know what? Just put it next to your bed. Then the next night, just open it. Then the next night, write the sentence, "I hate journaling, but my therapist is making me." Just start writing.
Right.
So those are some of the kinds of things that people can do to begin to get out of that stuckness, and unraveling the complications. You need to unravel them. And that's often where therapy and support groups can come in. And reading. David Kessler, the book that he just wrote on finding meaning, that he considers the 6th step of the Kubler-Ross, 5 stages of grief, where acceptance, which is the 5th step, was not enough for him when he lost his son. He needed to find meaning. So, I would recommend that book to anyone who feels like they're stuck in their complicated grief, because that helps to pull people out too, when purpose and meaning comes into play.
Well, Pat, I think this was very helpful, and I really appreciate you spending time with us tonight. I'm going to encourage everyone who's listening to visit our website, which is startingpoint.org. You click the education tab, and it will lead you to YouTube and our education channel, where you can find all of Pat's podcasts and a few others, from anger management to eating disorders. So please take a minute and take a look at it. Pat, thank you. And I suspect we're going to be doing part 4 of Doing Grief Well. So I'll be happy to talk to you tomorrow as you decide what the topic is.
Well, I told you from the beginning of this, I got about 30 ideas. So
Here we go.
it's a complicated situation. So many different nuances that we need to put them out there, and we need to have them available for people.
I think it's great. Well, Pat, thank you very much, and you have a good night too.